Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 8th, 1915. Well, let me read you from an article in the Washington Herald on this day in 1915. Here's the quote. Suffragists and antis went to the mat yesterday before the National Democratic Committee at the Willard Hotel. What had promised to be a dignified proceeding of great prominence was turned into a near riot at the close of the hearing. So anytime we hear about a near riot in the ballroom of the Willard Hotel, we have to talk about it on this show. But look, here's what's really at the heart of this story. We all know that this was an era in which women's suffrage, the right to vote, was being fiercely debated. And we tend to think of that debate as taking place between men and women, but it was also taking place among women. And that is the side of the story that has largely been forgotten or written out of history. So here to discuss this incident and this larger context is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hey, Jody.
And our guest for this episode is Kimberly Hamlin, Associate Professor of History at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and the author of a new book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jody. Hi, Nikki. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. And you were telling us, Kimberly, just before we started taping that you published your book the week that the world went sideways and everyone went into lockdown.
Yes. My book's pub date was March 17th. So I had my suitcase packed. I had all my outfits at the ready, only to have to unpack very unceremoniously a few days later.
And we launched this podcast like right around the same time too, and so we can empathize in putting out big new projects in the middle of everything going crazy. But look, here we are.
Here we are.
And I'm so glad that we're talking about this story in particular, because I think so many of us have fixed in our minds this image of suffrage, which is like this woman that looks like the mom from Mary Poppins, sort of swanning around in a silk dress and a sash that says votes for women and going up against these buffoonish men who are like, no, little lady, you can't have the vote. And it misses so much about what was amazing about this movement. It misses the Black women who were fighting for suffrage. It misses the men who were fighting for suffrage. And it misses all of these women who were fighting against women's suffrage. And so, Kimberly, I was wondering if you could paint for us a scene of exactly what was happening here in 1915. Was this a push for an amendment or what was going on?
So the riot that takes place in December of 1915 is at a meeting of the Democratic National Committee. So they're getting together to discuss their upcoming convention that summer and especially to debate the party platforms. So suffragists from various groups as well as antis all gather there to try to plead with the men to please, please, please include a statement or a plank in support of suffrage in the Democratic Party platform. This was a big goal for suffragists 1915, 1916. And they especially wanted the plank to say that the Democratic Party supported women voting by federal amendment, not state by state. So that's the real issue here. The sort of sub-issue is the rivalry among women, not just the pros versus the antis, but the various suffrage groups assembled at this meeting essentially hated each other's guts. So that is the other part of the story.
When you read this article that was in the Washington Herald, it kind of gets a little bit to how heated things were. And I guess I want to ask, how much is this a reporter really playing up this idea of a near riot? And it talks about how there were tears and, people were really at each other's throats. How much is that a reporter kind of wanting to spin a good story, and how much did that really capture the tenor of that day?
Well, I think it's a both. It's a both and question. So the reporter's language includes many adjectives that we would consider, offensive and sexist, about the tears, about the women. At one point, the reporter describes the suffragists as having more ardor than intelligence. So it's very condescending in tone. But the events, I think, are really a pretty basic, valid description of what happened. These women would come together every 3 to 6 months at various congressional hearings, at various Republican and Democratic Party events, and they would vie for their 2 minutes. They knew that the men in power basically had no idea who any of them were and really could not care less about their issue. So the stakes were really high to make sure you or your team got to speak and that you got to get your point across. So that part of the story, I think, really resonated with me and seemed true, as well as the heightened emotions that women brought to these events.
It's got to be so frustrating to spend all of that time marshaling your arguments, showing up, engaging in these not just heated debates, but really learned debates, right? Debates where both sides were pressing their points, and then to have them reported primarily by male reporters who are just treating it like spectacle, or like, look at these little ladies playing politics. I mean, reading that Washington Herald article absolutely infuriates me, because there's actually something really important happening here. But the way that it's sort of filtered through to the public is kind of a joke.
But doesn't that reflect the kind of whole project in general, which is you have these women fighting for their rights, but they have to appeal to men in order to get those rights? I mean, it's all about operating in a male space, right?
Although, interestingly, right, the antis are not fighting for their rights.
Yes.
So it's interesting, too, to see their arguments being filtered through this lens as well. And they were making interesting arguments. Obviously, I don't agree with their fight against women getting the right to vote. But somebody like Josephine Jewell Dodge, who was one of the leaders of the antis, who had been part of this campaign for ultimately over a decade, she believed that if women had the right to vote, it would take away this special place that they had carved out for women to act. So all of these organizations, all of this activism that women were already doing outside of the sphere of electoral politics, that they would lose the kind of, I don't know if it's special privilege or just like this women's space that they had made. And so she's arguing against suffrage because she wants to hold on to the political power that she's already obtained.
And the debate within the pro-suffrage camps, the rival groups there, was also very much about how do we attain power in this male space? So Alice Paul, the leader of the protest-oriented group of suffragists, which in 1915 becomes the National Women's Party. In the article, it's referred to as the Congressional Union, but they're one and the same. And her rival is NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Alice Paul and her allies want to protest. They want to vote out everyone in the Democratic Party, because from 1912 on, Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress and the White House. So they thought the real way to show women's strength would be to oust the party in power. The women of Nassau tended to be a little older. They had been doing this a lot longer. And they said, whoa, Alice Paul, the party in power changes every couple of years. We can't tick off this whole party. We need to be nice. We need to play nice with these guys. But they really struggled with how to play nice, because they didn't have quite the same access that the anti-women tended to have. The anti-women tended to be richer. They tended to be married to the men in power. So they had an easy entree, whereas the Nassau women really had to figure it out, how to get our way in. And in fact, one way they actually got a way in was through Champ Clark, who was another person mentioned in this 1915 riot that we're discussing today. Champ Clark was the Speaker of the House, and he ended up living next door to the woman whose biography I just wrote, who was on Team Nassau. So her name was Helen Hamilton Gardner, and she uses her next door neighborliness with Champ Clark as a way to bring the concerns of the National Association to Congress.
Yeah, and I love some of the details about the kind of protest tactics that were employed, especially by Alice Paul and others in her camp. I mean, this one in particular. So these were pro-suffrage advocates who would show up at the anti-suffrage meetings and ask embarrassing questions or applaud at the wrong time, which is such a good. I don't know if that's a protest tactic. I've never heard of it before, but that is so brilliant to just applaud on the wrong line and just sort of disrupt the rhythm of a meeting is kind of brilliant. I mean, where did they think of themselves as acting in a protest tradition in that way?
Alice Paul in the NWP definitely did. She had trained in England among the more protest-oriented and militant British suffragists. The women of Nassau definitely did not. So I think that's why the polite clapping was really brilliant, right? It's plausible deniability. Oh, we were just clapping. But Alice Paul definitely had trained in the protest tradition and brought that to the United States. And that was at the heart of the rivalry between her National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was precisely this question of tactics. And another really interesting tactic that's on display in this article we're discussing today is Sarah Bard Field. She was on Team Alice Paul, and she had just driven from California to Washington, D.C. with a petition bearing the signatures of 500,000 women to personally deliver to Woodrow Wilson. She just had arrived in D.C. on December 6th, just 2 days before the riot.
This is so interesting, right? Because first of all, Jody, those tactics sound like internet trolling,
Totally.
which is very much like as much as things change, they stay the same in a lot of ways. And all of these fractures within the movement, it's just the story of activism over and over and over again. These disagreements over tactics, these disagreements over how to get to where you all want to go. You might have this kind of shared goal, but how you get there is such a fractious question so much of the time. Especially, I think, somebody like Alice Paul and these women learning from suffragists in Britain were much more willing to use these militant tactics, which also I think is something we don't necessarily think about when we think about the suffrage movement, is that it wasn't all, dinners and debates. It could get actually much, much closer to a riot than this debate that happened at the DNC.
And I also look back at these protest and political strategies somewhat nostalgically, because one thing that really worked for all factions of the suffrage movement was the fact that men in Congress would write them back, that they had some sort of access. Mm-hmm. So now, like in 2020, when, I can't send an email with an attachment to my congressman, I can't just write and say, oh, hey, I'm going to be in DC. Could I come meet with you to talk about the concerns of my volunteer group? No, we don't have that level of access that the suffragists had. So they would organize, bring a small group to DC and have a meeting, which really was effective.
Let's talk a little bit more about the antis. Niki, I think you made a really interesting point about how one of the arguments was that women have already carved out a space in this progressive era for the kind of work. Correct me if I'm wrong. My hunch is that the men who opposed women's suffrage weren't making that argument. They were probably making more arguments like women can't handle the responsibility, or they don't want to, if they get involved in politics, they'll ignore their domestic concerns or whatever. Were the antis, were the women who opposed suffrage also making those kinds of arguments?
I mean, sometimes they were, yeah. And some of the more cultural arguments, too. There was a big thread of anti-suffrage arguments that suffrage was going to turn women into men, whether it was through their clothes, whether it was through their actions, that it was going to damage women, it was going to damage traditional families. And those arguments that a woman's place is in the home, there were definitely antis who were making that. And so I don't want to whitewash them, because a lot of these were women who had comfortable lives and had access to power because they were connected to powerful men. The patriarchy was working for them. So they didn't want to disrupt a world that had given them very comfortable lives. And if they needed to leverage these anti-woman arguments in order to maintain the structures that were serving them, they were going to do that.
And was the end goal, Kimberly, to convince other women, oh, you don't want the right to vote? Or was it to just convince the men who were the gatekeepers to not grant this?
I think it was a both-and situation again, but I feel like the priority was on convincing the men. And also by 1915, I think most people knew the tide was turning. They didn't know that it would be 1920 ratification, but they knew, oh, this is going to come. So by 1915, the antis were basically stalling. How long can we delay this seemingly inevitable change? So that was their main strategy. Keep these measures from being voted on, keep them from being taken seriously by the current men in office.
Yeah, longtime listeners will remember that we talked about how Wyoming, even before it became a state, when it was still a territory, had granted women the right to vote. And there were all of these Western states that had already granted women the right to vote. And so even as this fight was happening to prevent or to allow women to vote at the federal level, to grant it, nationwide, the women's suffrage was already on the march in the country.
And that's really what's going on in this riot at the Willard, right? The one who incites the tears of Mrs. Dodge was from Idaho, right? So here she's saying, well, how dare you? Like, I already vote in my state. Women have voted in Idaho since, I think, 1894. Who are you to say, Mrs. Dodge, who has no idea what my life is like, that I can't vote? So this role of Western women voting is really important in this larger story.
I will confess that there's a lot of this I don't get about what the antis were coming from, but part of it is just like the whole right side of history thing. Like, if you see where things are going, why are you so insistent on being on the wrong side of history? And I know people are complicated and they have their own, alliances and allegiances, but just part of me just can't get, just like, be a front runner, at least like see where the tide's going.
And so, Jody, oh my gosh, you are so intuitive there. That is precisely like a top 3 argument that women suffragists started making in the teens, saying to these men in Congress, like, this is going to happen. Why not do the right thing? But do you know why they said they wouldn't? 9 times out of 10, Black women voting in the South.
Right.
So this 1915 story was really like the high point of the separate spheres, women should stay in the home sort of opposition, because once Congress begins like actually seriously debating what it would mean if women voted, the only thing they talk about is Black women voting in the South, and that they're afraid also that somehow this would enable Black men to vote in the South too.
Yes, the slippery slope argument will always appear in any debate. Niki, you want to jump in here? I mean, what are your thoughts about the kind of various directions and angles in which this debate was playing out?
Yeah, and we should say, I mean, these antis, I realize that they seem strange and foreign to a lot of people, and that's always struck me as a little odd, because in many ways, they're still with us, right? It's Phyllis Schlafly in the 1970s fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment, leading the anti-feminist movement in the United States in a lot of ways. There was certainly anti-feminist sentiment, but she was the one who turned it into a political movement. Or think about the white women voting for Trump in 2016, the way that voting for somebody who was openly hostile to women, who had been so openly misogynistic on the campaign trail, we tend to treat this idea of women supporting misogyny as sort of alien. But we can look here at this, and there's a good 100 years right here that we can sort through of women organizing their politics around anti-feminism, because there's something else in it for them.
Kimberly, any final thoughts from you about the legacy of this story?
The other thing that really stood out to me about this 1915 riot was the subtext of race. So what they're really debating when they say, should women get the vote state by state or through federal amendment, is Black women voting in the South. State by state was basically a workaround so that no one had to deal with what it would mean for Black women to vote in the South. So that's the subtext of the story. And also women like Kate Gordon, who was a suffragist from New Orleans, who led this super kind of overtly racist camp of white suffragists, advocating for whites-only suffrage. So the other story that really resonates for me here is the extent to which white leaders have gone and continue to go to keep African Americans from the polls.
Yeah, and I think that's why those Black women suffragists are largely written out of the story, or they're kept out of the story because they don't fit neatly into the story we like to tell about suffrage, that it's this forward march that women get the vote in 1920, when, of course, most Black women don't have access to the ballot any more than most Black men have access to the ballot in 1920. And these Black suffragist leaders realized that. They were very aware of the way that racism was preventing them from having equal access to the right to vote. And that was inconvenient for many of the white women leaders, who were very quick to make sure that they weren't the face of the movement.
Okay, well, let's leave that there, and we'll start to wrap up. But now, Kimberly, I know we're springing this on you, but occasionally on the show we do also on this day, and we talk about a couple other things that also happened on this day. And well, you're our guest, and so we're roping you in on this. And you can dive in if you have anything to say about it. But also on this day in 1941, FDR declared that famous quote after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, "A date which will live in infamy."
Little known story, Jody. Actually, the original text had read "a date which will live in world history," which is not quite the memorable line that it would end up being. But Roosevelt scratched that out, and he made it "a date which will live in infamy," which is the line we all know so well.
Interesting. And then in 1993, we almost did a full episode on this, but we couldn't envision exactly how we would fill 15 minutes. But one of the best stories we've ever encountered. In 1993, this is the date on which a 6-year-old girl named Ilana Katan was visiting the White House for a Hanukkah party and did not notice that she was kind of leaning backwards and a nearby candle caught her hair on fire, and President Clinton ran over and kind of clapped it out with his hands, and it made the papers. It was a little bit of an incident, so we just want to rescue that from the annals of history. Great moment.
Just like Clinton rescued that little girl.
Yes, exactly. And for what it's worth, listeners, I did Google image search Ilana Katan. She seems to be doing quite well. She has full hair. She looks like she's a lawyer in D.C. right now. So, it's all good. But it is a great story. All right, let's leave it there. Kimberly Hamlin, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
And, of course, the book is Freethinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. We are very proud of our independence, and we are very proud of our listener support. As we've been saying, if you want to support this show as we get towards the end of the year and support Radiotopia in general, you can do so on our website, thisdaypod.com. You can offer one-time support, or you can become a monthly member if you are in a position to do so. Thank you to everyone who supports this show by giving and by listening and by spreading the word. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can find out more about the show at thisdaypod.com. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com with questions and comments about the show. On social media, we'd love you to join us there. You can follow us at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. We are posting all sorts of stuff every day there about things we don't get to talk to on the show, but every day you'll get one or two interesting little tidbits that happened on that day in history. So that's at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from